I can see it on the screen. La, la, la. Awesome. Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill, and I'm the Chief Diversity Officer here at the AAVMC. So welcome back. This is our first kind of outside episode of 2024. We just did a show with our data diversity and well-being staff a few weeks ago, but this is now we're going to turn our attentions to a full menu of content for this year. And this episode I'm really excited about because we are starting a larger discussion around disableism. And so you'll see a number of shows that will be kind of related, tangentially related, a piece over here, a piece over there during the course of 2024. Now, I want to put a little bit in context before we get into today's topic, which we'll be talking about technical standards for today. So approximately about 16% of the world's population has what the World Health and UN say significant disability affecting their life. Now, you know, we can all kind of quibble over what significant might mean for those of us who might have visible disabilities, you know, or things that folks can actually see or observable disabilities, perhaps. That number kind of might seem like, oh, does that strike right? But the reality is most folks, a lot of folks have invisible disabilities. Like you don't necessarily know that they have things. And a lot of those, but certainly not all, tend to fall into kind of the neurodiversity kind of continuum of things like learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, and on and on and on and on and on, right? So there's a lot of ways that both visible and invisible disabilities kind of can have these really impactful meaning ways on our life. But the reality is that if you are fortunate enough to live long enough, it's going to get you. Like disability is going to catch up one way or the other. And, you know, just to kind of prove that, there was a really interesting statistic that I was looking at before the show, and it was like 80% of 90-year-olds have like a significant disability. And I was like, only 80%? Wow, I want to know more about the 20% personally, but, you know, like it's coming for us all. And as my grandmother would say, no one gets out alive, right? And so, you know, the most common causes of disability here in the States are arthritis, back and spine problems, and heart conditions, all of which, unless you literally see people kind of falling out or creaking, you know, might not know, right? So you might not know. Now, when we kind of drill this down into academic veterinary medicine, which is where at least we have some data, we see in the colleges of veterinary medicine that roughly about 12% of our DVM students and faculty identify as having some type of disability. And the majority of those would kind of fall into those invisible categories, that kind of neurodiversity piece. But we also have graduates who are deaf. We have graduates that use wheelchairs. We have graduates with chronic illness. And so, you know, anything is really possible, potentially. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because there are some things that we kind of need to think about in that anything is possible. Right. And so today we're going to talk about a document that we released last year at AAVMC, our exemplar for technical standards. And we're going to talk a bit about what that means, how it works, and kind of what people need to know about kind of applying to and matriculating through programs with disability. So my guests for today's show are Dr. Leslie Sprunger from Washington State University. Hello, welcome back. And the wonderful Dr. Lisa Meeks from University of Michigan. Yay, Wolverines, right? Those Wolves, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Go Wolves, right? So as is our custom on the show, we like to have our guests tell us a little bit about themselves. So Lisa, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you. So I'm excited to be here today, and it was such a joy to work with the AAVMC in over the last year and a half. And so I am a associate professor of learning health sciences and family medicine at the University of Michigan. I also am the executive director of something called the Docs with Disabilities Initiative, which is an umbrella organization that is unapologetically dedicated to increasing representation in the healthcare workforce. And that is across all allied health professions, and professional professions as well. And so in that context, I do a lot of work around technical standards and things of that nature. I am a person who has developed a disability. So I lived about 37 years of my life without a disability and was diagnosed from the period of 37 to 40 with a degenerative autoimmune disability that will at some point significantly impact my mobility. It impacts my mobility now, but will do so even more in the future. So I like to say I'm on this learning curve of having done the work prior to personal experience with disability. And now I'm on an increasing learning curve of being a disabled person in this space and doing the work. What I can say with absolute certainty is that my commitment and my hypotheses, if you think about it from my research perspective, that disabled providers are essential for the workforce has been something that has just been increasingly validated in my personal experiences as a patient.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know I talk pretty publicly about my own kind of challenges as well. And yeah, this is important work whenever we come to it, but when it is personal, it hits hard, doesn't it? So thank you for that. Leslie, tell us about you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm also really very excited to be joining this podcast today. This whole process started, I would say, actually 2 years ago, when the Academic Affairs Committee of AAVMC invited Dr. Meeks to come and do a workshop for us. But so I currently am the Associate Dean for Professional Programs at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Washington State University. I am a veterinarian. I graduated from WSU, it was a really long time ago. But at a time in the mid 80s where this discussion of disabilities and their impact in education was really much more about more of a almost an exclusionary approach as opposed to an inclusive approach. Basically, can you do it? No, well, sorry, find another career. So I've been teaching in this vet school since 2000. I've taught gross anatomy and physiology, so courses that involve spending a lot of time with first-year students as they're new to the program and learning how to be vet students. I've been in an administrative role, various administrative roles. And so I've worked at multiple levels with students in our program with a range of disabilities. And I've really learned a lot over that 23 years. And I thought I knew kind of a lot. And then I had the good fortune of being given the opportunity to chair the task force, the AAVM task force, to develop this technical standards document and work with Lisa M. and a number of my other colleagues who are acknowledged in the exemplar document to really craft a really, I think, very useful document for veterinary medicine, which is, I think, a big step forward. And one of the things that we all of us on the task force would say was that we were all struck by how much we learned in the course of that process, from each other and from Lisa. So I'm kind of rambling now, but that's sort of how I come into this conversation, is as an instructor or an administrator who's really learned a lot and have tried over the years and now feel better able to help students who have disabilities and help us do a better job as a program understand what are the reasonable accommodations for those students.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So let's dig in. So Lisa, what are technical standards?
Well, I think it's great that we're grounding the conversation in the definition of technical standards because so many people conflate the idea of technical standards and essential functions and job duties. And so technical standards in the context of any health profession, or in this case, vet ed, refer to specific criteria or requirements for admission, progression, and graduation that try, and that try is very purposely used, that try to describe the essential capabilities and attributes that we expect of our students or our trainees. And it's designed to make sure that individuals who enter our programs, that matriculate, are going to be capable of doing the necessary physical, cognitive, even interpersonal work, that they have those skills that they'll be able to learn what we're teaching and master any procedural skills or master any techniques that we are teaching them. So in this way, technical standards are kind of our gift to, and I say gift loosely, to potential applicants to say, look, we're going to teach you a myriad of things, but in order to learn, to practice, to do these things, to understand, right? Learn, understand, cite, and perform these tasks, you need to have certain abilities. And traditionally, these abilities were situated in something called domains. So something like physical and motor skills, communication skills, perhaps something called sensory and perceptual abilities. Cognitive and intellectual abilities is still one that's around and pretty standard across the different programs. Ethical and professional behavior, that tends to be a newer domain. Emotional and mental health is a domain. And communication, as I said, and interpersonal work. So when associations or accrediting bodies decide that these technical standards are necessary and communicate these to prospective students, they're trying to do so in a way to set up expectations and to make sure that people are prepared to come into our learning environments. And as I said, learn and be able to perform the things that we're teaching them.
Yeah. So folks just kind of get a sense of what you're looking for in terms of these domains, right? So I remember I've been around, folks know I've been around for a long time too, Leslie. Like we've been around for a while, right? But there used to be these things like you have to stand for this many minutes, and and if you can't, then clearly you can't do surgery. And I'm like, I mean, of course,
Or see and hear, those are typical.
right.
Stand, see, hear. Those are all very ableist language selections that are included in many of the descriptions.
Yeah, and that got to this, this kind of approach that Leslie talked about earlier that really was more exclusionary focused versus, hey, this is what you kind of need to do this work. But maybe it doesn't look quite the way we think it looks. Maybe you have some other ways of getting to this, whether it's through accommodation or you've kind of come up with your own, coping mechanisms and that allow you to kind of demonstrate that you've reached, this particular standard. How do you think that has, you talked a little bit about that, Leslie. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what that transition has looked like over the years?
I think there's a couple things that come to mind. One is just sort of attitudinal shifts, right, over time. And not everybody is making that shift at quite the same speed, but overall, I think we have moved forward in, the profession and the educational community to learn to think a little differently about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And if what we're focusing on is the learning outcomes or the things that people should be able to do, right, then that creates some additional space to think about how they might do those things, right? So
Right.
that if you can achieve the same end result, but you get there a little bit differently, maybe we can live with that. The other piece of it, I think it's really important, is that the technological changes really impact this, right? So yeah, it's not that you have to be able to hear per se, but there are some things that we do that involve interpreting medical signals that have traditionally been picked up by auditory processing, right? The stethoscope is the perfect example, right? We have historically listened to cardiac rhythms with a stethoscope using our ears. Well, it turns out that now you can acquire that same data through a very different process and still be able to interpret it, maybe even better, right? Because now you don't have the vagaries of what is your range of auditory sensitivity. And, those of us who have been around longer, right, that's also a thing that just happens inevitably. Our hearing spectrum changes.
Yeah.
And so your ability, even though you might not think of yourself as deaf or hard of hearing, doesn't mean that you're actually going to be able to hear all of the things that you might really need to fully interpret the data set. So technological changes that allow us to obtain this data in different ways also create openings for people with disabilities that didn't exist, 60 years ago.
Yeah, sure. So why did we need an exemplar document? Right. We've got now 33 schools in the US and a bunch more in the pipeline. We have schools globally. This is, again, not a unique issue. This is something that I think academia writ large to some degree it continues to struggle with, but certainly health professions in general struggles with. How did we get to determining that there was a need for an exemplar document for technical standards?
Lisa, do you want to, I think you have the excellent answer to this, right? Because you and your partner, Grace Clifford, did that groundwork for our task force. Maybe that's a good place.
Yeah. So I think it all started when I attended the conference and we did, I did the talk and then we had further discussions. There were so many people who were saying, we're trying to look at our technical standards, we're trying to change them, but we don't understand them, right? As I said, there's so much conflation in what they are versus essential functions or job descriptions, how to change them, what's needed, what's not needed. And that was kind of the launch for the further conversation about doing some tech standards work. In that process, Grace Clifford and I went in, and because vet med is so small, we were able to actually look at the technical standards of the majority of institutions. So we did this content analysis and thematic analysis of the technical standards to see what was out there. And we discovered, not surprisingly, and I do want to say, this is not a vet med issue. This is a med issue, a nursing med issue, a PT issue, an OT issue. I can't tell you how many partnerships we've created over the last year. So vet med is not alone, but there were things that were included in technical standards that were discriminatory, were relying on ableist assumptions, didn't include a process or even the acknowledgement that you could find that, Leslie, as you described, another way to the learning objective, right? I always say the path isn't necessarily A to B to C. It could be A to C back to B. We just have to figure out what this looks like for different learners. As well, we found a lot of things that just were not technical standards at all, that had been thrown in almost like the kitchen sink approach to, if I had a learner and they had this issue and we had to deal with this particular interaction, throw it in the technical standards, throw this in the technical standards. And I think lastly, people misunderstand how you can use technical standards. Leslie, I'm so glad you said it at the beginning of this talk. Technical standards, although the expressed desire to share technical standards and the legal origin of sharing technical standards was in favor of individuals with disabilities. It was to be transparent in the process and to assist individuals with disabilities in finding where they might have a good home. What it quickly became was a mechanism of gatekeeping. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And it continued because these were just perpetuated. People copied, pasted them. We all wear 20 hats, right? No one has the luxury of the way things were 25 years ago, when we could actually really think about something and take that time and energy to explore it. We're all trying to make sure that we have all of the work done, that we're providing equity in meaningful ways, and yet people don't have the skills to do that. So I think even describing to folks what technical standards are, what they aren't, how they can be used, how they cannot be used. There was an over-reliance on technical standards to be a mechanism for keeping out people who would not fit in. And so really shifting the mindset of what this document is for, which is to support all learners, not just disabled learners, all learners. And we know all of us are in this field and do one thing or another. We all know that people come to us with natural innate abilities that lend themselves to being a small animal vet or a large animal vet or a surgical vet or a non-surgical vet. And in vet medicine, it's a little different in that you have to be able to do a lot of different things. But, still not everyone is going to excel at every single part of our curriculum. And so I think it's important to let everyone know, not just the disabled learner, every learner, what is absolutely essential. And then the most important part of our committee, which was an amazing, amazing committee. It was an amazing experience for Grace and I. Everyone on the committee was forward thinking, open-minded. It was just a beautiful set of individuals working towards a shared goal, but really making sure that not only do we communicate what the technical standards are and are not, but that we provide guidance around, what this might look like domain to domain. And of course, the AAVMC is not saying you have to adopt this, but we wanted to, the committee, right, wanted to support the constituents because this is tough. And we wanted to say, hey, we recognize this is a tough topic, even for people who are specialized in this. We've gone through and done all of the work to filter out some of the things that are problematic. And we're not only going to give you some examples, so exemplars, but we're going to tell you why. And to me, that was the important layer, the most valued layer for your constituents and leaders across vet med was, let me give you some suggestions, but not just take my word for it. Let me tell you why this is important.
Yeah. Go ahead, Leslie.
Well, I was just going to ask, so Lisa, in the LCME is the accrediting body for colleges of medicine in North America, I guess. And do they specifically require, they have much more detailed and specific accreditation requirements than vet med does yet. Is there a specific requirement for a technical standards document in the medical school requirements for accreditation?
Yes.
Okay.
Short answer, yes. But I do want to just expand that for just a second to say that requirement is very simple. It does not go into a lot of explanation. It does not offer exemplars. The requirement just states that a school must have and publish a set of technical standards, and they must be in keeping with the law. That's the extent of the requirement from the LCME. There's no checks and balances system. There's no example of what these might look like. Now, we've done some work with the AAMC, who is your medicine equivalent, in the same way that we've worked together for the AAVMC, which is to say, here are some examples. And in that training, we actually offered poor examples and exemplar examples and went through a little bit of why those exist. But as you might imagine, across all of the different specialties, so medicine, nursing, vet med, OTPT, SLP, whatever health professional degree we want to talk about, it's nuanced. right?
Mm.
What works in vet med may not work in medicine. What works in medicine may not work in vet med. So it's really important. And it's always such an honor for me to do the work, but it's also so rewarding to know that the associations are committed to this work. So having AAVMC be committed to the work and to producing a document that was solely focused on vet med was really important because, as we discovered, Leslie, in our committee, there are some things that we just could not carry over from medicine or
Right.
from other
Mhm.
areas.
Mm.
And so we spent
Yeah.
a lot of time having robust discussions about what do you actually need to be able to physically do in
Right.
veterinary medicine?
Yeah, and so the reason I asked that question about whether it's specifically required in the LCME accreditation requirements is that as of right now, the AVMA Council on Education, which is our accrediting body, does not specifically state, you must have a technical standards document, it must be published, et cetera, et cetera. That change may be coming. I don't know. That's not something that I have a role in, but that's part of the reason I think that there was such a huge range among colleges of vet med. Did they have a document like this? What was it called? Was it available? Was it only on their internal web? Things like that, because it's not a specific requirement. There's sort of an implied thing about you have to communicate clearly with your applicants about what your program looks like, but it's vague and it doesn't specifically address this one issue. So for us in vet med, this really is right now in the realm of best practice. It's not a formal accreditation requirement, but the Academic Affairs Committee at AAVMC, I think almost unanimously, was really very excited about having this document because this helps everybody to have this, as a starting place.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's clearly a benefit, right? These are questions that applicants have. These are questions that, colleges, again, because of this kind of history that is, part of it is patchwork, right? Where it's like,
right.
oh, well, yikes, we dealt with this one particular case and real talk, we don't want to deal with that again. So
Exactly.
cut to the chase, right? Like no sense in cleaning it up. The reality is we don't want to deal with that again. Put it over in that document so that people with that issue don't come here again. Right. And sometimes we just have to be that blunt. Right. Because that's really
don't realize is that your technical standards have to be tethered to an accreditation requirement or a learning outcome. You can't just have technical standards just because you don't want something in your program, right? They have to have some reasoning, and that reasoning needs to also be kind of very clear, as you would say, legally on its face. It needs to make sense.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the big things we started with. We kind of jokingly said, you can't say that an applicant needs to be able to do a cartwheel or stand on their head, because that has nothing to do with vet medicine. And you're not going to be able to draw a line. And if you think about it visually, tethering a balloon, right? If you think about the standard as a balloon, what is going to tether that down to the grounding? That's either going to be an accreditation standard or a learning outcome or a competency that is a joint, well-informed competency that everyone in vet med agrees is necessary for the practice of veterinary medicine. And we also found that across our group, there were differences in what was required. And that, I think, is where many schools struggle. Well, in medicine, I always give the example of, what does it mean to have to deliver a baby? In Alabama, at the University of Alabama, you have to do 10 live births. You are in there delivering that baby. At the University of California, San Francisco, you could be at the head of the mom. That's assisting in a live birth, and that counts. And those are, I think we can all agree, very, very different experiences, right? Those are very different experiences. So when you think about, especially for the subsurgical work or surgical work that's involved in veterinary medicine, that's where we start splitting hairs. What is required? And we had a great individual. We had so many great individuals, but we had some competency experts, some accreditation experts. It was a great group.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. One of the things that I find interesting but frustrating about ableism or disableism is that oftentimes, unlike some of the other isms, that ableism tends to get wrapped up in, like, these are good people who want to do good things, but oftentimes there is a very kind of patriarchal infantilizing that happens of folks with disabilities. And it's like, I'm going to protect you from yourself because you can't make this decision to go be an equine, blah, 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 and, you know, it's well-meaning, but we actually don't appreciate that we have really stepped over some lines, right? Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Benevolent ableism. It is, and it is so, it is this concept of I'm helping you, so you can't fault me. And I feel better about myself because I'm helping you, and poor you. So that can be expressed in these programs as waiving a requirement. So it could be something and Leslie knows I am very against waiving any requirement. You decide who you are and you graduate students based on those requirements. So it's waiving a requirement. It's inappropriately counseling people out of specialty areas without knowledge of what their abilities actually are. It's about assuming someone needs accommodations that doesn't, and really pushing that. That's your agenda, not theirs, right? It can be expressed in so many ways, but benevolent ableism is almost, we had this long discussion last year at a conference. It can be more harmful than your basic covert ableism, because in that sense, the person perceives that they're being so nice and so generous and allowing you into their space. And because on the surface, it appears that they're being thoughtful, it is harder to confront the individual with this, right? So it can be really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, really challenging. And, with much respect and deference to our wonderful colleagues, these are things that I spend a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time trying to push back on. And there's always this tension. And I love the kind of benevolent ableism piece, right? I mean, we even think about it as like, oh my goodness, how are folks going to deal with these issues in the real world? And I'm like, wait, this is the fantasy?
Yeah.
You're kidding, right? Like, this is the good part. Like, I tell my team and I joke because we're like, yeah, a good day is like the raccoon in the dumpster sharing the pizza. Like, this is the good times, right? And so, like, this, like, how are we going to prepare them? I'm like, well, for some of us with, disabilities and or other marginalized identities, like, we've gotten to vet school. Like, resilience is not an issue.
Oh, yeah.
Problem solving, not an issue. Some level of self-advocacy, also not an issue, right? You don't get to that level. And, this idea, I mean, and it is a very throwback. I'm hoping that as a Gen Xers, we're the last ones that are like, remember when, da, da, da. Back in my day with the one-wheel unicycle wagons, right? But this idea of, what about the real world? And I'm like, I mean, if it's worse than this, I'm tapping out.
Well, there's so much more flexibility, I think, is what you're getting at, is that you can create the environment you want to work in, and you can make those decisions about what to specialize in. You can make decisions about having medical or vet assistance. You can create an environment for the very first time in your practice that works for you. But I absolutely get what you're saying. I think another great example in the real world example is an internal sense of benevolent ableism, where admissions committees say, they'll be a great student somewhere, but we just don't have the resources and it wouldn't be fair to accept them, right? But what do we do in that moment when we say that? We place needs on that applicant that we actually don't have any evidence to support. So again, it's all feeding into ableism. I wonder if we want to just give a brief description of what ableism is, because our
Yes.
audience may not know.
Yes. Yes. Would you like to
Oh,
define it?
sure.
Go
So,
ahead.
I mean, just in a nutshell, a 2-second description is kind of the discrimination or prejudice or bias against individuals with disability in favor of people who are perceived to be whole or do not have any deficits. And, I mentioned overt ableism earlier. It certainly, ableism can be overt, it can be covert, it can be systemic level, right? If we think about policies and procedures within an institution or a training environment, those are all made by people.
Right.
So it's the ableism that is carried into those policies. And the only thing that I would add, I mean, that's a very general description, but the only thing that I would add is just a note to say to the audience, I have a disability. I've done this work for 20 years and I'm ableist at times. And I think we have to remember that we have all grown up in a society that is not only ableist, but that reinforces ableism at every stretch. Like just the other day, I don't know if you saw that quote unquote inspirational video of a father carrying his son up the subway stairs on his back because the elevator was broken. And people were talking about what a source of inspiration that was. And it's not a source of inspiration. It's a broken system that placed not only this father's health in danger, but that was degrading to the person with the disability to not have that independence. And so it's important that we understand that those are the messages we're receiving. So I don't ever fault anyone for not knowing what ableism is, not understanding how it's expressed. What I would say to the audience and to, educators is, now that you know, take a look, and ask yourself, when you're having these feelings that come up that are deeply internalized because that's what society has done, why do you have those feelings? And we all love our evidence-based work, right? So go back to the evidence. Are the facts supporting what you're feeling?
Yeah.
And I think in most cases, you'll find out that you actually don't have the facts. Yeah. So you've made an assumption or a hypothesis or a determination without really knowing all of the facts.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So important. And, I do think that again, I do think that folks want to do the right thing, right?
Absolutely.
But I also want to point out, that you talked about that systemic level. And for the audience, I think it's important to understand that all of those like hodgepodge, duct tape, throw it in with the kitchen sink things that ended up in previous technical standards documents, that's what it looks like when something becomes systemic. Right. The systemic issues, when you're kind of, if you're in the planning part, then it is very designed to be very exclusionary, like when it's first created, like boom, but then it just builds on that. Right. And so you get these kind of things that come into these documents because we don't have the resources. We can't figure it out. The technology is there, but it's over there and we can't get it yet here, right? But when we embed that into documents, then it means we're not going to experience that challenge again. We're opting out. And then we don't figure out the answer to that problem because it's no longer our problem. It's their problem, right? And that's when it becomes systemic, right? And it's systemic exclusionary practice. Yeah.
I think that the availability of the technical standards document helps, or maybe forces in some cases, people to step back a little bit and think more carefully about what it is that their expectations are. So, I mean, it's just human nature. People extrapolate from their own personal experience, often that's not a great way to be, but that is just how we're wired. And the tendency to say things like, well, maybe our program isn't for you because you'll have to do this, or maybe you need to think about a different career because when you get out there in, say, private practice, you might have to do this. And it was one of the things that we talked a lot about in the task force meetings, is making a clear distinction between technical standards document, which is about our educational program, right, versus what the eventual job description or essential functions might be. And I think, I don't know, this might be opening up a little bit of a can of worms, but I think it's particularly tricky in vet med because of our current status of, we don't have limited licensure. There is not a requirement for postgraduate training afterwards. And so in theory, everybody that graduates with a DVM, if they can pass the licensure exam, can go out and practice in a huge range of situations, working on an unlimited range of animals. And so it's very easy for people to think about all the things that are going to pose a problem depending on what your career choice might be after vet school. But we had to force ourselves to really think about, okay, but what are our program requirements? What are the technical standards and competencies that are required for our program? There's another piece of that, of course, is, again, you do have to make sure that the requirements of your program make sense and are grounded in your whatever accreditation requirements or degree requirements and things. But going through the process of thinking about the technical standards document, does actually encourage people to think a little bit more carefully instead of just doing that sort of knee-jerk, I don't know, this is what I've experienced, and so here's my wisdom that I'm going to share with you.
So how challenging was that? Because it really does require a bit of a paradigm shift, right? As a non-veterinarian who's hung around for many, many, many years, I lost count in the first year how many times people were like, veterinarians can do everything, like the cross blah training and all the species and all the medicine and you can do everything, right? And I'm like, and then it's like, no, you can't do everything, because if you can't do these things, you can't be a veterinarian. And I'm like, okay, but there's a whole career, so a bunch of career paths that you don't have to touch furry feather scale stuff. So, again, I'm an insider, outsider kind of person, but I'm like, there's this tension that is constantly there. And so, can you talk a little bit about kind of what were some of the most challenging kind of hills to climb during this process, Leslie?
Well,
no, you don't have to throw any colleagues under a bus.
No. I think was an interesting thing about the group is that many of us, we found we all had sort of very similar challenges and had to, think about things carefully. But one of the ways that is really significantly different, one of the things that's significantly different about vet med compared to, medicine, human medicine, is this expectation that whether they do it or not, our graduates are theoretically capable of working with a range of domestic animals, and the things that you do physically when you're working around horses, for example, are quite different than the things that you do physically when you're working around cats. And we all know that most of our graduates are not going to be in truly mixed animal practice setting. Most of them focus on a smaller number of species. But at the moment, our accreditation standards are such that we are supposed to be able to say that our graduates are competent in a range, working with a range of species, for example, and they're supposed to be competent with a range of both medical procedures and surgical procedures. And whether that's right or not, that is what our accreditation standards set as a sort of a functional boundary. So in our technical standards, we did actually have to include some things that address those competencies.
Mm.
It's tricky though, because we know, for example, some of our programs have very clear separate tracking programs. So from early in the program, students can select tracks, and they may never actually have to work with a TAT if they select an equine track. Other programs, like the one in which I operate, is explicitly a non-tracking program, and so we have more of this generalist approach. So this is a place where some of the programs that make use of this exemplar document may need to make some modifications of it, right? So our technical standards for a non-tracking generalist training program may actually be a little bit different than a program where they have a clear tracking, because their objectives may actually be different. Their requirements for graduation may be different. And again, though, you just have to think about it in terms of what are your actual outcomes and requirements, and what does that mean for your learners, and what do they need to know about that, right, coming into the process.
Yeah, those adjustments are going to be, I mean, yeah, because I mean, as someone who collects data on the colleges, as much as you all are similar, you are not. And so, you know, each school is very, very unique. So, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the attestation that's at the end of the document. And basically, for folks that don't know what that is, it's going to be kind of like your small print. Did you read this? Do you get it? Does it make sense? We know people like are supposed to read those, click the box, and they hit next, right? So tell us a little bit about that, and what is it, and what does it mean, and what does that checkbox that and you know, inevitably folks end up having to check. What does it really mean?
Well, let me just read what we wrote as the recommended attestation statement, and then we can sort of go from there, maybe pick that apart a little bit. And so what we said in the exemplar document is that you should sort of finish up with a section on attestation requirements, and it should say students enrolled in the DVM program will be required to review these standards annually and attest to their ability to meet the standards with or without reasonable accommodation. That phrase is critical, via the following statement. And so then the statement is this: from the student's perspective, I have read this technical standards for the DVM program at, you know, fill in your school, and attest that I'm able to meet these with or without reasonable accommodation. That's the extent of the attestation statement. And I think our recommendation annually is best practice, or perhaps at key points of the program, you know, like on matriculation, maybe at a point in time where they start to do surgical activities, or when they enter clinics. There's maybe some range in where that can happen. But so that's sort of the starting place in the exemplar document. And I'm wondering, maybe Lisa, you're maybe in a little bit better position to talk about this, is that what is requiring the attestation really mean, and why is that something that's important both for the programs and for the learners?
Well, I think, you know, Lisa, you kind of alluded to this in kind of bringing up the topic, which is our learners come in, they are asked to sign a million things. They're given a handbook. There's so much information coming at them. And we want to be sure they not only read this document, but that they understand that it's important. Now, for me, the most important reason that they're reading it is because some of them will be disabled. They will need accommodations for full access, and they may be considering not using accommodations because they don't know if that's permissible in this environment. They may have had a prior really poor experience utilizing accommodations, and they don't want to be outed as disabled. They may not have any idea what the curriculum entails. And so for most of our learners, they have some sense, they've done a little bit of shadowing. They have no idea what the actual clinical environment and the clinical training is going to be like. And so in that document, what I'm hoping learners see is the other critical part that we created as part of this committee, which is the language around disability inclusion, and that we want you to disclose and request accommodations. We want you here. We value you. and let's work together. So I want them to initiate that process quickly. And by having a signature on any document, I wish I could say I'm better at it. I get the DocuSign thing and I'm just like, click, 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 click. I don't know what I've signed. Probably given my children away a few times, but for a traditionally aged learner coming into this environment, signing anything may be a little bit more of a heavy experience, right? This is the first few times they're doing it. And so what I'm hoping is that it alerts them to the importance of the document, that maybe rereading it and paying attention to what it is will be something that they do. Now, from a risk management perspective, if I take off my disability advocacy, disability inclusion hat, and I go over to my kind of ADA hat and risk management hat, it's not going to keep you completely litigation free. But what the signing of that document does is it takes a complaint against the school that they didn't know. A student didn't know where to go to request accommodations. A student didn't know they would have to be able to do this. A student didn't know that they had to show up on time and, all of these other things. And it gives you a document that says the student saw this on this date, right? So it's date, time stamped, student signature, to say, we appreciate that a lot of information is coming at you, but you actually saw this document. So it's recognition that the student was made aware that there was some form of disclosure.
Yeah.
And not only disclosure, because disclosure in and of itself is not fully helpful, but that there was some referral to the process that you engage in to request accommodations. And I would say that's the number one complaint. You have a learner that's struggling. Maybe they go up from promotions committee and they say, well, I have ADHD, but I didn't know. Well, yes, you did. And I actually recommend programs do this yearly. And then to your point, Lisa, about becoming disabled at any time. And we see a lot of secondary diagnoses due to the primary diagnosis of being a student in these programs. But we see a lot of anxiety. We see a lot of depression that may have been subclinical before the learner came into our environment. And the pressure, the demands have made it such that this is now a clinical situation. So I like for learners to have that document put in front of them at each progression. So year 1 to year 2, year 2 to year 3, which is usually moving into the clinical space. And for the administrator, for the faculty, whoever is running this, to use it as an opportunity to invite disclosure, to use it as an opportunity to restate the commitment to disability inclusion. So it's not just this, we're going to get you if you say we didn't give you this, right? But it really is genuinely coming from a place of, we want you to be continually reminded that you have these resources available to you. But if we get to a point where you're like, I didn't know, we have it. This is important for all students. Anyone can become disabled, as we said, and it's important for all students to understand, not just students with disabilities. And I will acknowledge that some people say that this is really targeting individuals with disabilities, and it's another burden. I think because it goes to all students and because all students need to understand this within the program, that it's not. And you will have students that are having performance issues. You will have students that are having behavioral issues. They're much more likely to be dismissed for behavioral issues. That's at least the theme that we see, who do not have a disability. And so they also need to understand their requirements.
Well, I think that and not all disabilities are permanent. Right. And so there's also this, opportunity for folks to be like, oh, wow, I am struggling with this. And I mean, I know that it's not going to be a long-term thing, but maybe I actually can seek out some support for the time when it is, having a major impact. So as we get ready to wrap up, I have 2 remaining questions. One, Leslie, so while this document, is an AAVMC document really intended for the colleges, we also recognize that the resources that we create at AAVMC and than we talk about on the podcast, go a lot farther than the colleges. So do you see from a practical perspective how this kind of document might also influence, practitioners out in the field who are hiring our graduates?
It's a really interesting question. And it connects back to our previous conversation about, disabilities might be temporary. It's also true that disabilities that are not temporary may be an issue to a greater or lesser extent as the context of the learner changes, right? So the need for accommodations for a given disability might exist in the didactic phase of the curriculum, and then really not be relevant in our more clinical or clerkship phase. Or it might be the other way around, right? And so the importance of getting people to disclose early and work with what we call our access center here at WSU is really important, so that we can identify the appropriate accommodations. But then when they graduate and go out into whatever sort of area of practice they're now in yet another very different context, different expectations, different kinds of demands on their time and their expertise. And I guess what I would hope is that over time, we talked way at the beginning of the program about kind of an attitudinal shift, right? As people go through a program, if we have this as our framework for thinking about how to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, those people then move out and become the practitioners out there in the world. And so over time, I think hopefully that attitudinal shift then begins to permeate the profession more broadly. And people can think a little bit more flexibly about what is reasonable and what is helpful for individuals, and not without making assumptions. All the time.
Yes. One of the big questions that I always encourage people to ask related to DEI is what's possible versus like what's not, right? Or like, oh, we can't. I'm like, well, why not? Like, why can't we do that? So thank you for that. So one graduate at a time. Like one graduate at a time. And so our last question to my fellow Lisa.
Lisa.
Some Cold Jam. So we are supposedly on the other side of a pandemic, debatable. We're like the disability numbers just from the pandemic. In the first 18 months, just here in the US, we saw numbers of about like 1.1 million more people with disabilities. Long COVID. I mean, I just saw another article about long COVID this morning. And so, we know that disability numbers are on the rise. The cool stuff about some of the invisible disabilities is that we actually have better medicine. We actually have better screening tools. I have another project where we're talking about late diagnosed neurospicy people, right? Because some of us just thought we were a little off.
I say we sparkle.
We sparkle, yes. Some of us thought and it's interesting because there's a whole nother, we might end up going down that rabbit hole on a future show as well, just the number of women who somehow reach perimenopausal age and it's like, oh, there's ADHD, there's this, it's just, anyway, another rabbit hole. But we have better screening tools, right, for some of these things. And then we're seeing, the use of AI and other technologies to increase accessibility for, certainly education, professional opportunities, all kinds of things. So thinking about more disability, but also more tools, and again, graduating, one change agent at a time, how do you think all of this will impact the future of things like technical standards?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as you were talking about technical standards. We didn't talk about the origin of technical standards coming from this really important Supreme Court case, Southeastern Community College versus Davis. And in that case, ironically enough, that case was 1979. In that case, although they found for the school and against the plaintiff, the court said there may be a time when technological advances will be such that we would not have the same finding. And we are there, certainly with the deaf and hard of hearing community, we are more than there. And the courts have been consistently finding in favor of deaf and hard of hearing health professionals. I think first of all, give it up for AI. AI is frightening, frightening and helpful.
And
I
cool.
find I wanted to clone myself, and I've been able to do a little bit of that. So I'm leaning into the gratitude. It scares me, but also leaning into the gratitude. Like what we will be able to accomplish, all of us, what we'll be able to accomplish is remarkable as we move forward. And some of the greatest kind of innovation has come directly from people with disabilities. So as we stop and consider like what the next frontier is, what we will be able to do, and how we can remove, because it's all about removing barriers, how we can remove barriers. So not only disabled people, but people who, are dealing with one thing or another, whether that's temporary or whether there's just, someone is better at this than others. It has the ability to remove barriers and level the playing field like never before.
Yeah.
And I will go back to something that Leslie said about the attitudinal barriers. I think the technology is there, the proof, the evidence is there, and all of the people that we see out in practice, vets, physicians, nurses, again, OTs, PTs, scientists, we see people with disabilities across all disability categories thriving in these areas. So we have the evidence, we have the technology. There's one thing left, and that's the attitudes. And so I think as we enter this kind of, it seems like a period of renaissance. There's just so much happening in this space. I think we will be served well by focusing on anti-ableist and in my opinion, anti-oppressive education, because people have to do the internal work. I mean, you can say it's the system, you can say it's the processes, the policies, but all of that, when you deconstruct it, it's all people.
Yeah.
So changing hearts and minds is paramount. And, being able to disrupt our own biases and our own ableism. And like I said, it's okay. We're all there. We all know. This is the environment you've been brought up in. But it is our responsibility once we learn to take that, to harness that education and move forward with making sure that we are actively disrupting our own bias and our own ableism and creating environments that are more inclusive.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Do better, people. Do better. And that's including me, I mean, it's, I'll be really, really transparent as I wrap the show. I been dealing with a kind of extended illness with shingles over the holidays that has resulted in me being hard of hearing. I'm hoping temporarily, but we're not really sure, right? And so it's made me think a lot about just all kinds of things, even just like how far I'm willing to drive, because I'm not sure how well I can hear horns and other cars and stuff. And I'm like, this is not something I thought about. Oh, okay. So no highway driving, these kinds of things, right? And so it requires us, and it made me just think about just my own ableism around these experiences, and kind of like, oh my God, did I like do something terrible to someone? Those kinds of, but these are really great learning opportunities. And so, have grace, folks. With that, I will wrap today's show. Thank you so much to my guests, Lisa and Leslie. Really great discussion, really important work. For folks listening and watching, be sure to, follow us on social media, but also follow hashtags like disability advocacy, follow Lisa. There's, and once you follow one person, we know how these algorithms work, right? We know how these algorithms work. There's some wonderful, wonderful folks. And, to Lisa's credit, she said, like, listen to disability folks, right? Listen to folks with disabilities and talking about their lives, but also how they problem solve, how they navigate, and how sometimes they're like, yeah, we figured this out. We don't need your help. Like, we're good. Like, this is just what we need. Just boom, here. So, be sure to follow content creators that are really kind of out there doing this work. And I will also make sure that to also check out Lisa Meeks' podcast, which is called
Docs with Disabilities.
Docs with Disabilities. It's a great show. I listen to it regularly, so be sure to check that out. And so with that, we will wrap today's show. Thank you so much again to my guest, and we will see you next time.
Awesome.